Leadership Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Leadership Story Talks is produced by Narrative, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. In this podcast, Julienne, Ryan, and I, Jerome DeRoy, discuss ways in which we can create more engagement in our lives, especially at work. There are more people today who identify as disengaged at work than there are who say they feel engaged. We come from Narrative, which is a company that focuses on engaging businesses and their audiences through the power of listening and storytelling, and we employ a seven-step method to do so. And in the course of this podcast, we've obviously had lots of conversations with experts and thought leaders in their field. And today we have two such guests, not one, but two. One is Bertina Ceccarelli, who's on a mission to advance racial and gender equity in the tech industry and disrupt the status quo to build a more inclusive workplace. As the CEO of Empower, one of the most successful nonprofits in North America, she's committed to helping young adults and military-connected individuals launch tech careers and remove barriers to economic mobility. As a leader, she works to model an inclusive workplace, providing opportunities for growth at all levels. And we also have Susanne Tedrick, who's the author of Women of Color in Tech and a cloud computing technical trainer for a Fortune 500 technology company. Fiercely committed to increasing the participation of women and people of color in STEM professional opportunities, Susanne has performed community service work for a number of nonprofits, including serving as the former chair of the Advancing Tech Talent and Diversity Executive Council for CompTIA and coalition member of Empower's Command Shift Initiative. Together, they're the authors of Innovating for Diversity, Lessons from Top Companies Achieving Business Success Through Inclusivity, which just came out on March 28th and which you can find everywhere. And of course, that's the reason that they're here on the show. Bertina and Susanne, welcome to the podcast. So great to have you.
Thank you. It's such a privilege to be here this morning.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Of course. And Jules, hi.
Hello there. Happy as always to be here and so excited about this talk today. Thank you and this conversation.
Yeah, so it's a treat because we have the two of you here. So thanks so much for being here. And I just want to start maybe by asking you about the journey to writing this book. Why did you, I guess maybe there was a two-parter. How did you come together to do this, and why this book? Why this topic?
Well, sure. So there is a story. It's quite a few years ago, I had the opportunity to write the book Women of Color in Tech, which was released in 2020. The book was mostly based off of my own experiences transitioning into a technology career and to help inform and inspire other women of color to pursue these as well. So getting that technical skill, but thinking about how do you put yourself out there and how do you address some known and perhaps some not as much talked about challenges that women of color face in the tech industry. And during the release of the book, the publicist at the time actually got in touch with Bertina through her work at Empower. They were actually celebrating their Women of Color in Tech Day. And my publicist said, "Oh, I know the perfect person you need to talk to." And that's how Bertina and I started to talk with one another. And we had the opportunity to collaborate on a number of different projects. At one point, I was hosting a diversity in tech webinar series for John Wiley and Sons, and Bertina was one of the panelists to talk about active allyship. So we've had an opportunity to work on a number of different things together. And when it comes to this book, how we came with this, it was born out of our desire that we know that we could be doing more. So from the work that I do with training and mentoring young women in getting into tech careers and the phenomenal work that Empower does to bring more people of color in the technology industry, it's really talking to only one part of the story. We can provide the support, we can provide the skilling, but the conversation that's not really happening is what is happening from a diversity standpoint? What is happening from building the environment to not only bring diverse talent into the industry, but what are we doing to support them? What are we doing to promote them and have them be able to bring all of themselves and be successful? That conversation it's been happening. We talk about DEI for sure, but when we look at the statistics, when we look at the metrics behind it, we see a different story being told. We're not nearly where we should be, given all of the time, commitment, effort, money that has collectively been spent on DEI for the past couple of years. And so I think Bertina and I really wanted to write something that said, well, yes, DEI is hard, it is not impossible. And giving people guidance, giving people strategies on, regardless of what kind of organization you run, here you can see where other successful companies, through the lens of innovation, have been able to do really great things with diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm wondering, you mentioned, Susanne, that you noticed that there's, I think, well, I'm paraphrasing, but I think what you said was that, there's a lot of time and investment of money that's been put into DEI, especially in the last couple of years. And of course, we see, many more headlines and papers being written about that. And we certainly see a lot of, at least from our point of view, reasons to do it better. But then, as you mentioned, and it seems like time and money is put into that. But then, as you mentioned, it looks like maybe there's still a pretty big gap. And I wonder, from your point of view, because I know you talk about this in the book, but why do you think that is? Why do you think that DEI programs fail so much of the time, if I can use that word?
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, I think that's a fair assessment because for all of the commitment that we are supposedly putting in, we don't see results. We also don't see accountability. And in the book, we talk about the different reasons why. But we think perhaps one way that it's not serving very well is coming from a place of compliance. When you're being told to do something, you're likely going to act a specific way versus I care about something. And so when you're doing these programs saying, just be nice to people because, our corporate organization said that you should, or some compliance body said that you should, you're going to get a particular result. You're not as invested, you're not as committed. And so doing these compliance-driven, checking the box types of DEI trainings don't really help anyone, except maybe foster and have persist negative feelings about DEI programs and why they don't work. Doing DEI programs in a silo also doesn't help. If we're not having the hard conversations with our employees, with our peers, then they're doomed to fail because we're not getting this continuous feedback loop. What are we doing well? What are we not doing well? If we're not applying data, if we're not looking at metrics and seeing what is working and what isn't, and then quite frankly, just making sure that there is accountability. If you, for lack of a better term, if you have no skin in the game, how likely are you to make the investments or take the challenges? It's nice to say we care about that, but what are you doing to back that up? What are you risking from a personal standpoint to make sure that this happens?
One of the ideas that Susanne surfaced that we found was such an important piece of DEI today that we wanted to probe and understand differently was this compliance mindset. And as we talked to a number of leaders about the implications to culture around a compliance point of view towards DEI, we landed on the notion that we should flip the script a bit around the concept of innovation, right? Because for those companies that moved beyond compliance and recognized, hey, look, there's some business value to diversity. We buy in and we understand and we have seen the benefits of how greater diversity can lead to better product development, greater innovation, better performance within our companies. But very few were actually looking at the reverse. If you apply a lens of innovation to diversity and begin to think differently and challenge those old practices and old ideas that really kind of lend one to more of a check the box approach, and by doing so, really getting at some of the underlying problems, underlying barriers that create systems that prevent diversity from thriving. So as we think about why programs fail, it's often for the very same reasons that innovation broadly fails within a company. Not asking the right questions, not moving beyond kind of a check the box approach to product development, sales growth, and in this case, diversity.
I want to comment and say I acknowledge that, because check the box was a big part of the culture I grew up in, with some companies that were considered very forward thinking in their pursuit of diversity and what they were saying. But you were in the recruiting area, you were pressured to hire. And then the point was, oh, there's nobody in the pool. But I think the problem there was nobody went to see why weren't they showing up. One company had a particular bias towards Ivy League graduates. Well, everybody was looking at the Ivy Leagues, and the span of options was limited, as opposed to saying, where are other options and why aren't other people in the pool and why can't we look past that? Same thing with well-intentioned internship programs. You know, which ones were funded? Not everyone could afford to be a credit only program, because that's when you had to earn your monies for the year. So there was so many things to say, okay, the path of good intentions were there, but were they digging deeper enough? So that's why I really liked your book, because you went into the good, the bad, and the ugly about what happens along the way. So thank you.
And maybe we can get into that a little bit, because you know, the question I asked earlier was, you know, why do programs fail? And you mentioned this idea, this compliance issue, that's kind of how people have seen it traditionally. How did you get how did you kind of establish trust with those that you mentioned in the book, for example, and I'm sure there's many others, but in general, how do you establish trust to actually to get people to actually share those failures, so that, you know, you could kind of move to a point, okay, we now know what's not working, and now we can move to a point where, how could we make this work? I'm curious about that establishment of trust, because it's, especially in this area, which is quite sensitive, not a lot of companies are willing to talk about what's not working. And it seems such an obvious thing to do, especially when we talk about innovation. I mean, that's kind of the rule number one, is notice what's not working and then see what you can do to make it work. So I'm curious about that in your own process and approach to this book, and, you know, the people and companies that are mentioned in this book.
And how many lawyers did you have to go through?
Jerome, I think that's an incredibly insightful question. And I think one of the things that differentiates this book is we talk about real companies, real people, real names, and real stories, and really try to move away from generalities. And it wasn't easy. And I think the approach of looking at these issues through that lens of innovation helped considerably, because when you set the tone that, hey, look, that's part of the game of innovation and taking risks, you're going to fail. But if you can learn from those mistakes and improve iteratively, and look at your DEI objectives as just an integral part of the business, that becomes an easier conversation to have. So I think really looking at this as a business issue and a case study, created a space where individuals were comfortable sharing very openly what worked and what didn't, what were the lessons they learned, and how they improved. But I think the other thing that I would say to that trust building is that the individuals we selected to talk about this topic also carried very passionately about the personal motivations behind why DEI matters. And I think to a person and to a company culture, generally wanted to help others too.
Mm. Mm.
Mhm.
Right, right. But give the benefit to that. Sorry, go ahead, Suzanne.
So if I can just add to that, certainly understanding the personal motivations for the people that we spoke to. In fact, during one of our conversations with Michael C. Bush, the CEO of Great Place to Work, one of the things that he was very adamant about was it's got to be personal. It's really personal for you to be able to be so candid and so open and honest. And so for the people that we had the sincere pleasure and honor to talk to for the book, they've always come at that with this sincere appreciation for why diversity, equity, and inclusion is important and wanting to serve a larger population. I think in the times that I've talked to people, I've talked about some personal things about how perhaps well-intentioned DE&I initiatives have perhaps negatively impacted me in the past. So thinking about situations where I've been asked to go to recruiting events because I happen to be of a certain color and a certain gender, and it just looks good. Or I'm given, some level of autonomy for appearances, for optics, but when it comes to actually getting promotions, getting asked to have a seat at the table, it's a different conversation. And so just being willing to have them be as candid with me about their struggles. I'm very candid about the struggles that I've had in the past as well.
So it sounds that's what comes across the book, that the people you were talking to, this was not just a press release soundbite, that they had really invested some time and were willing to, show what it takes, and which is so important, to give people guidelines and be reality based what it takes. And it doesn't happen. It's not a month. It's a devotion to doing something big and small consistently over time.
Yeah, and just I think the other thing I want to point out there is your the use of your own selves in order to advance something, right? That you tell something of yourself, and then someone else will share it, and without that kind of loop of what I guess we would call listening and storytelling, that there's that relationship between the two. Once you share something personal of yourself in this context, it really does open people up. And I think that's a great insight for our listeners, actually, who, and this is going to be my next question, who sort of wonder, where do I start with an initiative, around diversity and inclusion that's not going to be a simple check the box thing. And I think, for us, there's always the issue of what we hear a lot is, well, we don't have the money to do this, but I often tell people, what if money wasn't an issue? What would actually be the starting point here? And then kind of go from there to see what's possible and what's not. But I'm curious, from your point of view and your research, what do you think are or what do you see as the kind of starting points for building an effective DEI approach?
Maybe I'll start with a few comments, and I know Susanne has a lot to say on this as well. I think if you just set aside time and money, and you really look at the companies that are doing this well and what makes their diversity efforts work, it starts at the top. There is a CEO who is unapologetic and is unwavering in his or her support for building DEI across the culture of an organization, full stop. And it's also that individual's senior executive team and the board of directors. But the second thing I would say to that, while that is absolutely necessary to have that level of support, it's not sufficient. It's also really critical that those middle managers completely buy in. This is sort of the magic, I think, of some of the stories that we tell in the book about those middle managers who felt that they had the air cover from their senior leadership, that even though they might not necessarily be in HR, maybe they're, a technology director, or they're the head of a business unit in a particular area of the company, and they've come to a conclusion that they're not getting the best talent. And so they will collaborate with their HR business partners, but they will take this sort of innovation approach to say, how can I really listen to what the real problem is and get underneath it and try something different? Look, there were a couple of cases of some managers who went a little rogue and just decided that they were going to try something because they felt so passionate about it. And guess what? If you look at the case of City of Northrop Grumman, the managers who were just insanely creative demonstrated superior results in recruiting, retaining, developing diverse talent through a multitude of new ideas like apprenticeships and internal training on new skill sets that were important, but really hard to access in the communities they were searching from. That now those programs have been scaled and operationalized. So while leadership at the top is important, buy-in and courage in the middle levels is important. I would also say this idea of iteratively piloting, taking some risks, understanding what works, and being fearless about operationalizing great ideas. And it doesn't always have to be hugely expensive. Susanne, what would you add?
Yeah, totally agree. And to add some thoughts there, I think for any organization, big or small, it really is to understand and define, well, why is diversity, equity, and inclusion important to you? Because it's going to help define what it's part of your culture, but it is going to help to kind of steer how you might decide to set up your programs and initiatives. And whatever that is, if it is because I want to capture more of the hearts and minds of perhaps a larger customer base, or there is something that I'm personally invested in because I see the benefits of it, that has to be clearly defined, because I think it makes it easier for leadership and others in the organization to understand this is why we're investing the time, this is why we're investing the resources to be able to do that. Thinking more about a cost standpoint, because it can be expensive. I think according to the Society of Human Resources Management, companies spend anywhere from $30,000 to $5 million on diversity, equity, and inclusion each year. And so we understand that that's always going to be a concern, but it doesn't have to be prohibitively expensive. One of the things that we talk about is starting small. So not attempting to try to boil the ocean, but thinking about these small ways that you can carve out initiatives. Maybe it's going to be mentoring. Maybe it's having partnerships with local businesses. The point is to have some kind of action, okay, and lead that through, learn from it, iterate on it, make it even better, get away from the things that weren't working, learn from those experiences. So taking the time to do smaller projects and smaller initiatives, I think, can be particularly helpful. And there are many different organizations and resources that are out there that want to help you along that journey. So if it is just learning about what diversity, equity, and inclusion is, or more specifically, how do you carve a program that makes sense for your organization? Because DEI for a small family-owned business is going to look vastly different than for a multinational bank. And it has to. It has to. So understanding that you're not going to know everything, but there are resources and places that are willing to help you develop those plans, develop those strategies, can get you in the right direction, and they needn't be cost prohibitive.
I think that's wonderful. I mean, one of the things that I'm really appreciating, I got this from the book, but now hearing you, it reinforces that the language you're using is really not the language of compliance. It's the language of business. It's the language of innovation. It's, even saying something like, we're not looking to boil the ocean. It's something you hear leaders say all the time about a new product, or, let's get that minimum viable product out first and iterate on it. And it makes complete sense that we would treat something that's so vital to any business, but can be seen, because I'm assuming that, that might be the resistance, is that, oh yeah, well, we're just doing this for compliance. But actually, I think what your book does and what you're saying really turns things around a little bit and creates a language that people can connect with in a way that perhaps they couldn't connect with language that was used previously. I wonder how much that impacts the success or failure of DEI programs, the language that we use, how we approach it, the failure of saying, why are we doing this, and articulating that so well. Not much of a question there, more of a comment or reflection, but feel free to comment or reflect on that.
So I think because Bertina and I really are people who focus on, outcomes. We want to make sure that the time and commitment that we're investing in just about everything that we do from a business perspective is working. And we feel so strongly about diversity, equity, and inclusion that why wouldn't we want to approach it? We're very serious about it. Why wouldn't we want to approach it with that same level of tenacity and sincerity? Because we don't want DEI programs to fail. It actually pains me when we see, so taking things from what happened with George Floyd, and we saw all of the major outpouring and major commitments that companies were making. We're going to do better. It's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. And then 2 years, 3 years later, where are we? So when we see things like that, when we see those lost moments and those lost opportunities, and then in contrast with some things that are bubbling up to the surface now, where we're kind of seeing this backlash a little bit towards DEI, it's hard not to be upset about that. And so I think for both Bertina and I, we take it very seriously because it's a topic that's very near and dear to our heart.
And I think this notion, right, of really, really honing in on the language really is critical. And as I think about what Susanne is saying, right, around so many of those CEOs who made just huge proclamations, some of which has contributed to backlash today, particularly as we see layoffs in the tech sector and beyond. But when I think about that, I also reflect on something that we write about in chapter 9, right? Growth mindset versus a restrictive mindset. Some of that backlash is a result of people feeling as though this is a zero-sum game. If we open up opportunities for certain individuals, that means I'm going to miss out. And what we've seen is that really progressive companies who look at DEI with a growth and expansionary promotional mindset perform better, and opportunities are lifted up for everybody. And so I think we have to constantly challenge that idea of DEI being any kind of a zero-sum game. And that absolutely, right, we need to focus and prioritize on where are there deficits within an organization and go right into that and solve the problem. But it doesn't mean, right, that other people are somehow going to fail. And I think that's a huge mistake that many make.
That's great, because when you look at anger, when we use storytelling and bringing out in coaching sessions, it's usually finding the root of what is triggering something where they think there's going to be a loss, as opposed to something they can move forward in. But relationships is the other thing you stress. So I love the fact you have this practical handbook, here's the good, the bad, and ugly. Here's what worked, here's what, and you sum it up all the time. You give somebody some tools to think about, but you keep stressing relationship. There was one group of non-traditional hires in one company where they were drop kicked, doing tech, and say where they were floundering. And you're like, no, they need more mentorship. They need to be somebody to weigh in. You can't just outsource that and say, okay, I've done my job. I have, a few hires here. I hope they do well, and not realize you have to invest on a daily basis, no matter who you're managing, but particularly in these situations, help people succeed, and invest some time. So I think that's been the uplifting part of reading this. So I think it should be on everybody's bookshelf everywhere. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, speaking of these, stories and kind of the various successes that you've seen, I'd love to, if you would maybe choose one or two that you could tell us and our listeners about that are mentioned in the book where you have seen that sort of success, where things either got turned around or an initiative. I know you've mentioned a few in passing here and there, but maybe we could home in on one in particular, perhaps your favorite.
Sure. So one of my favorite stories in the book has to do with Online Optimism, who are a marketing media firm based out in New Orleans, and the founder, the owner, Flynn, is just a wonderful, wonderful human being, and is just doing great work. And I appreciated the story because he was very candid about the fact that it didn't start great. It did not start great in terms of a relationship that he had with a particular client that was serving an underserved community. And the very frank and direct feedback that he got about the language that you're using, the approach that you're using, you're potentially alienating an entire audience, and you don't realize it. And hearing that from a business leader with no filter and just being very candid was very heartening, because you don't see often that level of vulnerability in talking about, this is a time where I didn't do so well, and it had ramifications on my bottom line. But what I really appreciated about it was, rather than chalking it up as it's a you problem versus it's a problem for me and my organization, is that they took that as a point of, okay, let's see where we can make this better. And so going to workshops, going to trainings, really kind of understanding where those deficiencies were, and then really taking the mindset that it is not always going to be perfect, and that you will, on this path, make mistakes. The important thing is recognizing them and keeping moving in your efforts. And so in response to George Floyd, rather than take a very passive approach of just saying we support and doing, social media tiles with no real substance, he stopped and said, no, we're not going to do that. That is not how we're going to play this out. And really was very thoughtful and thorough about what should we do from our perspective to make this meaningful for our organization and our local community. And honestly, it takes a lot of guts to kind of go against when people are just like, oh, I don't know, I'm afraid, or we don't have the resources, or it's not time. But he and his staff were like, we're going to do this anyway, and we're going to keep reiterating and getting better. Okay, and we're going to learn from our mistakes, and we're going to keep moving. And so for me, that was definitely one of my favorite interviews for the book.
Great, thank you.
Bertina, do you have a favorite?
I love them all, but I'll just mention briefly, I think, the case studies of Citi and Zendesk. And I think of those two because they had identified some very specific business problems that they wanted to solve through a DEI strategy that really did end up being a business strategy and operationalized across their organizations. And with Citi, this is their operation just outside of Dallas. It was a technology, part of their technology operations. Huge growth, just rapid growth. And of course, these days, Dallas is a really, really hot market in tech and competitive for tech talent. They had done some internal analysis and recognized that they had recently hired a number of veterans who were thriving. And they realized, we should hire more veterans. Maybe that is just one approach we should be a little bit more creative around. And so they partnered with my organization, Empower, and recognized that the training that we were providing, we're getting the veterans part of the way there, but recognizing that there was an additional level of what I think of as last mile training that was really critical for them to succeed. They internally developed an apprenticeship program that really surrounded those individuals who were largely from the enlisted ranks, who may not have necessarily had a lot of technology experience other than this first part of training through Empower. But in the experience of this apprenticeship program, they recognized, wow, we're getting some additional technical skills and certifications, but we're also getting surrounded by mentorship. We're getting shown the ropes of how to navigate a really large bureaucracy. We're getting introduced to other veterans and plugged into the employee resource group. At every step along the way, right, they recognized there was another layer of support, of supervision, of counseling, of guidance that they could surround these individuals with, to the point where after the apprenticeship program ended, over 90% would get converted to full-time employees, and they would have an especially long retention period, higher than employees from other sources of recruitment. So this was an area they decided, it is working here. Let's replicate that as a way to introduce more veteran talent. Again, a form of diversity, but also a form of bringing just a different set of experiences and thought processes into the technology part of their organization. So that's one that I think stands out as a great success. And then I think with the Zendesk, their problem was not having enough women in senior level positions, that women were really under indexed compared to male counterparts. And in really doing some deep listening, the problem that they tried to solve, or the intervention, was let's try some mentoring early in a woman's career. And they were very thoughtful about how they matched mentors with mentees, some deep training for the mentors, establishing connections that built the social networks, and introduced the idea not just of mentoring, but sponsorship and allyship across the organization. And it was so successful that they've now begun to reach parity at the senior levels, men and women. But they've also now introduced their mentoring program to other groups across the organization. And again, bring a good idea through iteration and piloting across the entire company.
This is great. I mean, to get these, it's one thing to get sort of the theory behind and the approach, and then to actually hear these stories, it really rounds out everything. So I
For sure.
appreciate, I appreciate you sharing those. And again, as Jules said, it's such a great book because of that. There's a great kind of combination of that theory and the approach, and then how to do it, and also hear some examples and case studies. So we're getting to the end of our hour here, and I really, Jules, well, do you have any other thoughts or reflections or final questions?
I have a ton, but that's
I know.
going to happen.
Can you do it in 30 seconds?
No, I just have so many more, but it is interesting because no, we have to stop. We have to let them talk and do what we always say we're going to do, stick with the format. But thank you for that opening. I have 20 questions. You just have to hang out after we finish recording, and I can ask one or two more. Okay, thank you.
We'll have to do a part 2. But I want to leave it again to the two of you, Susanne and Bertina, if there's anything that you would like to any final words or thoughts around this whole issue of DEI and innovation and your approach for our listeners, because I know that they love to get these kinds of insights and perspectives.
Sure. So I think something that I try to let people know is that when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, you needn't have a certificate or doctorate or a degree. All you have to do is just care and want to have the conversations. And I would say in order for DEI to be successful in any conversation, everyone has to be part of the conversation. So have the hard talks, have the difficult conversations, but also think about what are the ways that we can turn things around. And that's something that everyone in the organization can do, regardless of where their title is or where their station is in the organization. So have these conversations often.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
I would maybe add, and this is really kind of taking a page from your narrative playbook, which is have the courage to listen and be open to hearing something that is going to challenge your assumptions, and then figure out what you can do with that.
Wonderful message. It begins with listening, as we often say, and it's not easy to do, especially when we're talking about topics where difficult conversations may arise. So I love that we're ending on that note, and I want to thank you again, Susanne and Bertina, and I want to remind people of the title of the book, which is "Innovating for Diversity: Lessons from Top Companies Achieving Business Success Through Inclusivity." It's available right now everywhere you find books. And I also want to tell our listeners that when you can go and find many of our episodes on our website on narrative.com, NARATIV.com. Please remember to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and leave a review, because that's what drives the word of mouth. And also to let everyone know that we are running a 3-part workshop series entirely online that's open to the public. You can learn more about that on our website. But it's a great opportunity to learn how to better listen, learn what kind of listener you are, but also how to find, craft, and tell a powerful leadership story of your own in a safe and supportive environment. And as always, you can go and find out lots of different kinds of resources and information on our website on how you can find, craft, and present the stories that will engage your audiences like nothing else has before. We're always ready to listen to you. And so again, I want to thank you, Jules, for being my wonderful co-host today.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure. And it's always a great discovery. So thanks for giving us the gift of time, and keep listening, everybody. Cheers.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Susanne. Thanks so much, Bertina.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.